Your hands were on my bare skin. Now you must take all of me before dawn. It's a tale as old as time, a desperate plea in the face of the unknown. If you enjoy stories of survival, honor, and the bonds forged in hardship, be sure to like this video and subscribe for more. The man who lived in the shadow of the granite peaks was a creature of routine and silence. His name was Silas, though no one had spoken it aloud in years. The wind and the pines were his only neighbors, and they were not given to conversation. His world was a small, defensible patch of land carved from the unforgiving wilderness. A sturdy log cabin, a well-worn path to the creek, and a line of snares that marked the edge of his territory. Each morning began the same. Before the sun crusted the jagged ridge, he would be outside, the cold air sharp in his lungs. His movements were economical, stripped of all wasted effort. He chopped wood not with rage or frustration, but with a steady, metronomic rhythm that spoke of long practice. The axe rose and fell, and the clean scent of pine filled the air. The lines at the corners of his eyes came from years of wind and dust, not laughter. His beard was trimmed short, practical, and his hands were calloused maps of a hard life. He was not old, but the youth had been weathered out of him, leaving something more durable, like petrified wood. After his morning chores, he would take up his rifle, a heavy, oiled piece of steel that was as much a part of him as his own arm, and he would walk his perimeter. His gaze was constant, sweeping across the vast expanse of rock and timber. He wasn't looking for anything in particular. He was looking for everything. A broken branch, an unfamiliar track in the dirt, a shift in the way the wind moved through the valley. These were the words of his world, and he was fluent in their language. His solitude was a fortress he had built around himself, stone by stone, year by year. Inside the cabin, the same deliberate order reigned. A single bed, a stone hearth, a rough-hewn table with one chair. Every tool had its place. Every tin of supplies was stacked with precision. There were no pictures, no keepsakes, no remnants of another life. It was the den of a wolf, a place of shelter and function, not of comfort or memory. He was a man who had whittled his existence down to the bare essentials of survival, and in doing so, had found a kind of peace. It was a cold, lonely peace, but it was his. He asked for nothing from the world, and in return, he expected the world to ask nothing of him. The unspoken contract had held for a very long time. That afternoon, the sky turned the color of a fresh bruise. The wind, usually a steady whisper, began to snarl and bite, driving a vanguard of ice-hard snow before it. Silas had seen storms like this before. They came down from the high peaks without warning, a white fist intent on scouring the world clean. He moved with a practiced urgency, securing the shutters, checking the caulking around the single-glass window, and bringing in enough firewood to last for days. The air grew thick and heavy, the silence of the wilderness replaced by a rising howl. The first flakes were small and sharp, but soon they were joined by a blinding curtain of white that erased the horizon, the trees, and the very concept of distance. He stood for a moment on his porch, a dark, solid shape against the swirling chaos, letting the sheer force of the storm wash over him. It was a power he respected, one of the few things in the world that could match the unyielding nature of his own solitude. He was about to turn, to retreat into the warm, firelit heart of his fortress, when he saw it. A flicker of movement in the maelstrom. It was there and then gone, a smudge of darkness against the overwhelming white. He stilled, his eyes narrowing. It could be a deer, driven down from the high country. It could be a trick of the light. But he did not trust tricks of the light. He remained motionless, his gaze fixed on the spot. The wind tore at his coat, plastering snow to his beard, but he did not seem to notice. Then it appeared again, closer this time. Not one shape, but two. They were humanoid, stumbling, fighting against a wind that sought to tear them apart. They were moving with a desperation that was painful to watch, their progress measured in inches. Silas felt a stir of something he had not felt in years, an intrusion. His world, so carefully ordered and controlled, was being breached. His first instinct was to withdraw, to bar the door and let the storm have them. They were not his concern. The wilderness was impartial in its cruelty. It was not his place to intervene. He watched as the smaller of the two figures fell, disappearing into a drift. The other figure stopped, turned, and struggled to pull their companion back to their feet. The effort was futile. They were losing. They would be buried in minutes. A muscle in Silas's jaw tightened. He had made a contract with the world, but he had also made one with himself, a long time ago. A code buried so deep it was part of his bones. He turned, strode back into the cabin, and grabbed a coil of rope and a heavy lantern. He did not want to do this, but he knew he would. He moved into the blizzard, not with the frantic energy of the figures he'd seen, but with the steady, ground-eating pace of a man who understood the terrain. He kept his head down, the lantern held low, its flickering light a small, defiant sun in the white chaos. The wind shrieked, trying to rip the light from his hand, but his grip was like iron. He found them huddled behind a small outcrop of rock that offered pathetic shelter. Two women. The taller one was on her knees, desperately trying to shield the other, who lay motionless in the snow. They were dressed in thin, worn clothes, completely inadequate for the mountains. The standing one looked up as his light fell upon them, her face a mask of fear and defiance. Her eyes were wide, and he could see the fight in them, even as her body trembled from cold and exhaustion. He didn't speak. Words were useless against the howl of the storm. He simply knelt, his movements calm and deliberate, and gently pushed her aside. He scooped the smaller woman into his arms. She was terrifyingly light, a bundle of cold limbs and wet fabric. Her head lolled back, her face pale and still. For a moment, he thought he was too late. He turned, expecting the other woman to follow, and saw her still on her knees, staring at him. He could not read her expression through the swirling snow. Was it suspicion? Terror? He gave a short, sharp jerk of his head, an order to follow, and began the arduous trek back to the cabin. The journey was a battle. The snow was already deep, and the wind was a physical force, pushing against him with every step. The woman in his arms was a dead weight, and the one behind him struggled to keep up, her hands clutching his coat for guidance. Finally, the faint, warm rectangle of the cabin window appeared through the blizzard. He kicked the door open and carried the unconscious woman inside, laying her gently on the bearskin rug before the hearth. The other woman stumbled in after him, collapsing against the door as she slammed it shut, cutting off the deafening roar of the storm. The sudden silence was a shock. In the warm, dim light of the cabin, he got his first clear look at them. They were young. The one on the floor, Lyra, was barely a woman. The older one, Alara, pushed herself to her feet, her body swaying. Her eyes, dark and haunted, were fixed on him. He ignored her stare, his focus entirely on the girl by the fire. Her breathing was shallow, her lips tinged with blue. He knew he had to get her warm, and fast. He began to work, his hands sure and practiced. He cut away the frozen layers of her dress with his belt knife, the steel glinting in the firelight. As he peeled back the sodden fabric from her arm and shoulder to check for frostbite, the older sister lunged forward. "Stop," she hissed, her voice a raw, broken thing. "Don't you touch her." Silas paused, the knife in his hand, and looked up at her. He saw not just fear in her eyes, but a deep, ingrained distrust of men, a history of pain he could only guess at. He didn't explain, didn't try to reassure her. He simply met her gaze, his own expression unreadable, and then slowly, deliberately, set the knife down on the hearth. He picked up a thick wool blanket instead, wrapping it around the unconscious girl. He looked back at Alara. "She'll die if she stays in those clothes," he said. His voice was rough from disuse, like stones grinding together. Elara stared at him, then at her sister, then at the fire. The desperation in her eyes was a wild thing. She took a staggering step forward. "Your hands were on my bare skin," she whispered, the words aimed not at her sister, but at him, a strange, desperate accusation. "Now you must take all of me before dawn." It was an offering born of terror, a bargain she thought she had to make. Silas merely looked at her, his expression unchanging. He shook his head, a single sharp gesture. He turned back to the fire, picked up a kettle, and began to heat water. The offer was refused. The bargain was not accepted. And in the oppressive silence of the cabin, surrounded by the screaming wind, Elara understood that she had encountered something she did not know how to fight. A man who wanted nothing from her. The storm imprisoned them for 3 days. It was a relentless, roaring entity that shook the very logs of the cabin and piled snow against. The windows, until the world outside, was nothing but a dim blue-white haze. Inside, a strange, silent truce took hold. Time was measured not by the sun, but by the rhythm of survival. Silas moved about the small space with an ingrained quietness, his presence large but not oppressive. He tended the fire, melted snow for water, and prepared a thin, savory broth from dried meat and herbs. He offered a bowl to Elara on the first morning. She took it, her hands trembling slightly, but her eyes never left his, watching him as a cornered animal watches a predator, waiting for the inevitable attack. It never came. He ate his own meal standing by the window, his back to them, affording them a privacy that the single room could not otherwise provide. He did not speak unless necessary, and his words were always functional. "More wood for the fire. Drink this? Is she warm?" Lyra, the younger sister, drifted in and out of a feverish sleep on the bearskin rug. Elara tended to her with a fierce devotion, wiping her brow with a damp cloth and whispering words too soft for Silas to hear. He watched them from the corner of his eye, seeing the bond between them, a small, fierce warmth in the cold reality of their situation. He saw the way Elara's hand would instinctively check her sister's breathing, the way she would flinch if he moved too quickly. He understood that he was a potential threat, another man in a world that had clearly given them every reason to fear men. So he made himself smaller, quieter. He carved small wooden figures, a bird, a wolf, the knife moving with fluid precision in his large hands, his focus entirely on the task. It was something to occupy his hands, to keep his gaze lowered. On the second day, Lyra's fever broke. She awoke, weak but lucid, her eyes finding Silas in the dim light. Fear flickered across her face, and she shrank back until Elara was there, a protective shield. Silas simply gave a slow nod of acknowledgement and went back to his carving. He did not approach them, did not try to force an interaction. He was a mountain, a feature of the landscape, impassive and constant. The trust, when it began to form, was not a sudden breakthrough, but a slow geological process. It began with Elara noticing that when he handed her a bowl of stew, he never let his fingers brush hers. It grew when she saw him meticulously cleaning his rifle, his movements precise and respectful of the weapon, a tool for provision and protection, not aggression. It solidified when, on the third day, she awoke from a light doze to find he had draped his own heavy coat over her as she slept in the chair, while he himself sat on the cold floor, his back against the wall, keeping watch. The action was so contrary to every experience she had ever had that it disarmed her. Later that day, she picked up a needle and thread from a small kit he had on a shelf and began to mend a tear in Lyra's dress. The simple domestic act felt monumental in the charged silence. Silas glanced over, his hands stilling their work on a half-finished carving of a deer. He watched her nimble fingers for a moment, then went back to his own task. A silent understanding passed between them. They were both builders, menders, survivors. The cabin was no longer just his den. It was a shared space, a temporary sanctuary held together by a fire, a roof, and the unspoken agreement to cause no harm. The air began to change, the oppressive tension slowly giving way to a quiet, watchful coexistence. When the storm finally broke on the fourth morning, the silence it left behind was profound. Silas opened the door to a world transformed, buried under a thick, pristine blanket of white. The sunlight was blinding, glittering off the snow with a cold, merciless beauty. The air was so still and sharp, it felt as if the world was holding its breath. For the first time, Ilara and Lyra stepped out onto the small porch, blinking in the bright light. They stood beside him, three dark figures against the vast, silent landscape. The sheer scale of the wilderness, the towering peaks and endless forests seemed to press in on them. For a long moment, no one spoke. The peace was fragile, temporary. With the end of the storm came the end of their enforced sanctuary. The world, with all its dangers, had returned. It was Ilara who broke the silence. "We were running," she said, her voice quiet but clear in the still air. She was not looking at him, but out at the distant mountains. From a man, Jedediah. The name was spoken like a curse. He bought our passage from the old country, said it was for work, indenture. She paused, and Silas could feel the weight of the unspoken horrors in that single word. He thinks he owns us. He and his men. We ran when we had the chance. She finally turned her head, her gaze meeting his. It was a direct, challenging look. She was not asking for pity. She was stating a fact, laying the final card on the table. They will look for us when the snow melts enough to track. Silas listened without expression, his face as impassive as the granite cliffs behind him. He looked from her to the valley below, his eyes tracing the paths a rider might take. He saw the vulnerability of his position, the way the cabin stood out against the snow. He saw the tracks they had left, now mostly covered, but not entirely. He knew that men like this, Jedediah, were relentless. They saw people as property, and they did not suffer the theft of their property lightly. His gaze swept the horizon, the old, familiar habit taking on a new and deadly significance. He was no longer just watching for the turn of the weather or the movement of game. He was watching for predators of a different kind. He turned his gaze back to Ilara. Her chin was high, her stance proud, but he could see the deep fear she was trying to conceal. She was resilient, a survivor, but she knew what she was up against. She had told him her story, and in doing so, had placed their fate in his hands. He could tell them to leave. He could point them toward the nearest settlement, a week's hard journey away, and wish them well. It would be the sensible thing to do, the act of a man determined to maintain his solitude. But the code buried in his bones would not allow it. He had brought them into his fortress. They were under his roof. He looked at Lyra, who stood slightly behind her sister, her thin frame still frail, but her eyes holding a quiet strength. He had seen enough of the world to know what would happen to them if Jedediah found them. He gave a single, slow nod. "I'll reinforce the door," he said. The simple, practical statement was his answer. It was his promise. He was not a man of soaring speeches or grand declarations. His word was in the grain of the wood he chopped, the solidity of the roof he maintained, the unwavering steadiness of his gaze. Ilara held his eyes for a long moment, searching for any hint of deception or regret. She found none. She saw only a quiet, unshakable resolve. A wave of relief so profound it almost buckled her knees washed over her, but she did not let it show. She simply nodded back. The lines were drawn. The quiet cabin was no longer just a shelter from the storm. It was now a fort, and its silent master had just declared war. In the days that followed, a new routine began to form, one born of shared purpose and impending threat. The silent coexistence of the storm, became a quiet, efficient partnership. Silas did not treat them as guests or as burdens. He treated them as capable allies. He saw the strength in Ilara and the resilience in Lyra, and he gave them the respect of responsibility. One morning, after his perimeter walk, he returned to the cabin, not with his usual rifle, but with a smaller, lighter one he retrieved from a heavy wooden chest. He set it on the table before Ilara. It was older than his, the stock worn smooth with use, but the steel was clean and well-oiled. "You know how to use one?" he asked. Ilara shook her head. "Then you'll learn," he said. He took her outside into the blinding white of the snow-covered clearing. He was a patient, methodical teacher. His instructions were sparse, delivered in his low, gravelly voice. "Hold it here, firm against your shoulder. Don't pull the trigger. Squeeze it. A slow, steady pressure. Breathe out as you fire." He stood behind her, close but not touching, his presence a steadying force. He corrected her stance with a gesture, a tap on her elbow, his movements impersonal and focused purely on the task. At first, she was clumsy, the rifle heavy and awkward in her hands. The recoil from the first shot startled her, sending a jolt through her shoulder and making her stagger. But she did not give up. She set her jaw, listened to his quiet corrections, and tried again. And again. Lyra watched from the porch, her hands wrapped in a shawl. Silas had her tasked with different work. He showed her his snares, how to set them, how to bait them for rabbits and grouse. He taught her which winter berries were safe to eat, and which roots could be boiled for a bitter but nourishing tea. He was giving them the means to survive, to be self-sufficient. He was giving them agency. He was arming them, not just with weapons, but with knowledge. The shared work filled the long, quiet hours. When he chopped wood, Ilara would be there to stack it, her movements becoming as efficient as his. When he brought back a rabbit from the snares, Lyra would help him skin and clean it, her initial hesitation giving way to a practical acceptance of what was necessary. They ate their meals together at the rough-hewn table, the single chair now supplemented by 2 crates. The silence was different now. It was not the tense, watchful silence of the storm, but a comfortable, collaborative quiet. It was the silence of people who understood each other without the need for constant talk, their communication flowing through shared tasks and synchronized movements. One evening, as Lyra stirred a pot of stew over the fire, she began to hum a soft, sad tune from her homeland. Silas, who was sharpening his axe by the firelight, paused his work. The melody filled the small cabin, a thread of fragile beauty in their harsh, practical world. Ilara watched him, expecting him to tell her to stop, to object to this intrusion of softness. But he did not. He simply listened, his head bowed over his work, the rhythmic scrape of the whetstone against steel the only accompaniment. In that moment, the cabin felt less like a fortress and more like a home. The 3 of them, a silent man and 2 fugitive sisters, were slowly, unconsciously, mending the broken pieces of their lives and weaving them together. The fence was being rebuilt, not just around the property, but around their small, unconventional union. The false spring was a cruel deception. A week of warmer weather melted the top layer of snow, turning the landscape into a treacherous mix of slush and mud. It made travel difficult, but not impossible. Silas knew their window of isolation was closing. His perimeter walks became longer, more frequent. He'd leave before dawn and return after dusk, his face grim, his boots caked in mud. He never said what he was looking for, but Ilara knew. She saw the way his eyes constantly scanned the low passes, the way he would stop and listen, perfectly still, for any sound that was out of place. The tension in the cabin grew with each passing day. It was a low hum beneath the surface of their daily chores, a constant awareness that their peaceful interlude was living on borrowed time. One evening, Silas returned later than usual. He didn't speak as he entered, but the set of his jaw was harder than ever. He stripped off his wet coat and hung it by the fire, then went to the small chest where he kept his ammunition. He laid out the boxes of cartridges on the table, the brass casings gleaming in the lantern light. Elara watched him, her heart pounding a slow, heavy rhythm against her ribs. Lyra, who was kneading dough for bread, stilled her hands. "You found something," Elara stated. It wasn't a question. Silas looked up, his eyes dark. "Tracks," he said. 3 riders, shod horses. 2 days old, maybe 3, down in the South Valley. They're casting a wide net." He didn't have to say who they were. The name Jedediah hung in the air between them, an unspoken poison. He picked up a cartridge, his thumb rubbing over its smooth surface. "They're moving slow because of the melt, but they're methodical. They'll work their way up the mountain." He looked at Elara, his gaze direct. "They'll be here, soon." The news landed with a heavy thud in the quiet cabin. Lyra's face went pale, and her hands clenched in the dough. Elara felt a cold knot of fear tighten in her stomach, but she pushed it down. She had spent too long being afraid. She met Silas's gaze, her own steady. "What do we do?" she asked. His plan was simple, brutal, and entirely in character. There would be no running. There was nowhere to run. The wilderness that had been their shelter would become their trap if they were caught in the open. "We make our stand here," he said, his voice a low rumble. "This place is defensible. A single approach. They won't be expecting a fight." He began to outline his strategy, his words clipped and precise. He pointed to the window, the door, the small loft space. He assigned them positions. He spoke of fields of fire, of cover and concealment. He was no longer just a homesteader. He was a tactician, and it was clear this was not the first time he had prepared for a siege. He was transforming their home into a kill box, and he did it with a chilling efficiency that told its own story of a violent past. Elara and Lyra listened, their fear slowly being replaced by a grim resolve. He was not protecting them by hiding them away. He was trusting them to stand with him, to fight alongside him. That night, no one slept much. The fire was kept low. Silas sat in his chair, his rifle across his lap, his eyes fixed on the door. Elara sat at the table, cleaning the smaller rifle over and over again, her movements mechanical, her mind racing. Lyra, despite her fear, insisted on being useful, quietly preparing food, wrapping strips of cloth for bandages, her small, determined actions a rebellion against the approaching darkness. The cabin was a tinderbox of suspense, waiting for a single spark. The morning of the 3rd day, after Silas found the tracks, dawned gray and unnerving. A thick fog had rolled in overnight, blanketing the valley and clinging to the trees in a damp, ghostly shroud. It muffled all sound, creating an atmosphere of intense, claustrophobic silence. The world outside the cabin window was a formless white void. Silas stood by the window, a motionless silhouette. He hadn't moved for over an hour. The waiting was a form of torture, a slow tightening of a knot in the pit of the stomach. Every creak of the cabin logs, every drip of moisture from the eaves, sounded as loud as a gunshot. Elara stood by the hearth, her rifle in her hands. She had checked the load a dozen times. The weapon felt heavy, cold, and terribly real. She watched Silas's back, drawing a strange sort of comfort from his stillness. He was like a rock in a swirling sea of dread, an anchor point. Lyra was in the small loft, peering through a small gap between the logs that Silas had made for her. Her task was to watch the rear of the cabin, a less likely but still possible route of approach. Her face was pale, but her eyes were wide and focused. Suddenly, Silas stiffened. It was a subtle shift, a tensing of the muscles in his shoulders, but Elara saw it immediately. He leaned closer to the window, his gaze piercing the fog. "They're here," he breathed, the words barely audible. Elara's heart leaped into her throat. She moved to her position beside the door, her knuckles white where she gripped the rifle stock. She could hear nothing but the frantic beating of her own heart. Then a voice cut through the fog, startlingly close. "Ho, the cabin." It was a man's voice, rough and confident, oozing an unearned authority. "Jedediah, we know you're in there, Alara. You and the little one. Come on out. We saw your smoke. No sense in hiding." Another man laughed, a harsh, ugly sound. Silas remained silent, his body a study in deadly patience. He did not answer. He did not move. He waited. "Don't be stupid." The voice called again. "Closer now. That's my property you've got. I've got a bill of sale. We can do this easy, or we can do this hard. Your choice." Three figures began to resolve out of the fog, walking slowly toward the cabin. They were dark shapes, their rifles held casually, their arrogance a palpable aura around them. The man in the middle, Jedediah, was large and slovenly, with a cruel twist to his mouth. He stopped about 30 yards from the porch. "Last chance," he snarled. "Send him out, old man. They ain't worth dying for." Silas finally moved. He didn't raise his rifle. He simply unlatched the door and stepped out onto the porch, pulling the door closed behind him. He stood there, empty-handed, his arms hanging loosely at his sides. He looked small and insignificant against the backdrop of the cabin, a lone man facing three armed predators. Alara watched through a crack in the shutter, her breath caught in her chest. What was he doing? Jedediah chuckled, a low, greasy sound. "Look at this, a hermit with a death wish. I'll ask you one more time. Where are the girls?" Silas's voice, when it came, was quiet, yet it carried with absolute clarity in the damp air. "They're not yours." The statement was flat, devoid of emotion, and utterly final. It was not a negotiation. It was a declaration of fact. Jedediah's face darkened. The pretense of civility vanished. "Wrong answer," he said, and began to raise his rifle. In that split second, Silas moved. He was not a man anymore, but a blur of pure economical violence. The world exploded in a symphony of chaos. Jedediah was still raising his rifle when Silas, in a movement too fast to properly track, dropped from the porch and drew a heavy pistol from the small of his back. The fog erupted with the deafening boom of the firearm, a sound that seemed to tear the very fabric of the air. The man to Jedediah's right grunted, a look of shocked surprise on his face, before he crumpled to the ground, a dark stain spreading across his chest. Before the other two could react, Silas was already moving, rolling behind the meager cover of a woodpile. A second man, younger and faster than Jedediah, fired a wild shot that splintered the logs of the porch where Silas had been standing a moment before. Inside the cabin, Alara acted on pure instinct, her training taking over. She shoved the barrel of her rifle through the firing slits Silas had prepared, found the younger man in her sights, and squeezed the trigger, just as Silas had taught her. She didn't pull. She squeezed. The recoil slammed into her shoulder, but the shot was true. The man cried out, clutching his leg as he fell to the muddy ground, his rifle skittering away from him. Now it was just Jedediah. Enraged and momentarily confused, he sprayed a volley of shots toward the woodpile, the bullets thudding into the stacked logs. He was wasting ammunition, firing from rage instead of aim. Silas remained hunkered down, patient, letting the man expend his fury. "You're dead? You hear me?" Jedediah bellowed, fumbling to reload his rifle. "They're mine. The law says they're mine." It was this moment of distraction that Silas was waiting for. He rose from behind the woodpile, his pistol steady in his hand, and fired once more. The shot was not aimed to kill. It was precise, disabling. The bullet struck Jedediah's rifle, shattering the wooden stock and sending splinters flying. Jedediah yelled in pain and surprise, dropping the ruined weapon and clutching his hand. He stared at his hand, then at Silas, his face a mask of disbelief. The fight was over. It had lasted less than a minute. The decisive, brutal efficiency of it was terrifying. The younger man was groaning on the ground, trying to stem the bleeding from his leg. The first man lay silent and still, and Jedediah, the predator, was disarmed and defeated, his power broken. Silas walked out from behind the woodpile, his pistol still aimed at Jedediah's chest. He didn't say a word. He simply stood there, his face grim, the smoke from his pistol barrel curling into the damp, foggy air. The door to the cabin creaked open, and Alara stepped out onto the porch, her own rifle held at the ready. Her face was pale, but her eyes blazed with a fire Jedediah had never seen before. She was no longer a victim. She was a combatant. Lyra appeared behind her, holding a heavy cast-iron skillet like a weapon, her small frame radiating a fierce, protective energy. Jedediah looked from the silent, deadly man in front of him to the two women on the porch, women he had considered his property, now standing as his adversaries. The arrogance drained from his face, replaced by a dawning, pathetic fear. He had not come looking for a fight. He had come to collect what he thought was his. He had fundamentally misunderstood the nature of the man in the mountains, and the strength of the women he had brutalized. His mistake had cost him everything. Silence descended once more, thicker and heavier than the fog. The only sounds were the pained groans of the wounded man and the steady drip of water from the pines. The sharp, acrid smell of gunpowder hung in the air, a stark violation of the clean mountain scent. Silas kept his pistol trained on Jedediah, his expression unreadable. The raw violence of the last few minutes seemed to have flowed through him and left no trace, like water over a stone. He was built for this kind of brutal calculus. Alara slowly lowered her rifle, though she did not release her tight grip on it. The adrenaline that had coursed through her veins began to recede, leaving a deep, trembling exhaustion in its wake. She looked at the still form on the ground, then at the man bleeding in the mud, and finally at Jedediah, who was now staring at his splintered hand with a look of whimpering disbelief. She felt no triumph, no satisfaction, only a profound, grim finality. This was the end of a chapter of their lives, a chapter written in fear and flight, and it had ended in the only way it could have, with violence. Silas finally spoke, his voice low and cold. "Get him," he said to Jedediah, gesturing with his pistol toward the wounded man, "and get off my land." Jedediah hesitated, his eyes darting around as if looking for another option, another angle to play. He found none. He looked at Silas's face, at the unwavering barrel of the pistol, and knew that his life depended on his next move. Scrabbling, he half-dragged, half-carried his injured companion, pulling him back toward the fog-shrouded tree line. "You'll hear about this." Jedediah spat, a final, impotent threat. "There's laws." Silas didn't respond. He simply watched, his silence more menacing than any threat. Jedediah did not look back. He and his groaning burden disappeared into the mist, swallowed by the wilderness. The immediate threat was gone. Silas stood for a long moment, staring into the fog where they had vanished. He then turned his attention to the body that remained. There was no ceremony, no wasted emotion. It was a grim task that needed to be done. He retrieved a shovel from the lean-to beside the cabin. Alara watched him, then went back inside. She returned with the strips of cloth Lyra had prepared and a bucket of hot water. She knelt beside him as he worked, and without a word, began to clean the blood from the porch steps. Lyra came out and started to gather the spent shell casings, her small hands methodically collecting the gleaming brass pieces from the mud. They worked together in the gray, misty silence, cleaning away the ugliness that had invaded their sanctuary. They were not just cleaning wood and dirt. They were performing a ritual. They were cleansing their home, reclaiming their space, and processing the violence they had endured and participated in. Each action was deliberate, freighted with unspoken meaning. When the grim work was done, Silas walked to the edge of the clearing and stood there, his back to the cabin, resuming his endless watch. Alara went inside and began to prepare a meal, her movements steady and sure. Lyra stoked the fire, its warmth pushing back against the damp chill of the fog. The bond between them had been forged in the crucible of shared danger. They had faced death together, and in doing so, had irrevocably tied their lives together. The quiet cabin was no longer just a shelter. It was a place that had been defended, a place that had been bought and paid for with courage and blood. It was theirs. The next morning, the fog had lifted, revealing a clean, rain-washed world. The air was crisp, and the sky was a brilliant, cloudless blue. It felt like the first day of a new world. The specter of Jedediah was gone, a bad dream that had faded with the dawn. With his departure, an unspoken question settled over the cabin. The sisters were free. They were no longer being hunted. They could leave. They could try to make their way to a town, to find a different life among other people. The path was open to them. Silas seemed to understand this. He was even more quiet than usual, his presence withdrawn. He gave them space, as if he expected them to pack their few belongings and walk away. He did not ask them to stay. He would not ask them for anything. The choice had to be theirs, and it had to be freely made. He went about his morning chores, chopping wood, checking his snares. His routine was a constant, a fixed point in a changing world. But there was a difference. He would pause in his work, his gaze drifting toward the cabin, a flicker of something unreadable in his eyes, before he would resume his task with a renewed, almost violent focus. Inside, Ilara and Lyra spoke for the first time of their future. It was the longest conversation they had shared since arriving. "We could go," Lyra said softly, her eyes on the distant, sun-drenched peaks visible through the open door. "We could find a town." Ilara was silent for a long time, her hands busy mending a tear in Silas's coat, a task she had taken upon herself. "What kind of life would we find there?" she asked, her voice low. "Working for another man? Fending off others like Jedediah? There are always more like him. Here," she trailed off, her needle pausing. "Here we are not afraid." Lyra looked at her sister, then around the small, sparse cabin. It was not a place of comfort or luxury. It was a hard, demanding place. But Ilara was right. In this small cabin, under the protection of the quiet, dangerous man who asked for nothing, they had found something they had never known before. Safety. They had found a place where their worth was not measured by a bill of sale, but by their resilience, their capability, their courage. They were not property here. They were partners. Later that afternoon, Silas was repairing a section of the small corral fence that had been damaged in the fight. He worked with his usual intense focus, his hands deftly setting a new post. He heard a sound and looked up. Ilara was walking toward him, carrying a bucket of water. She didn't say a word. She simply picked up the tools he wasn't using and began clearing the debris from the fence line. A few minutes later, Lyra joined them. She had found a small, protected patch of earth near the side of the cabin where the sun hit just right. With a small trowel she had found in the shed, she began to turn over the soil, preparing a small garden for the herbs she had been carefully drying. Silas stopped his work, the hammer hanging loosely in his hand. He watched them. He watched Ilara, her movements strong and sure as she worked beside him. He watched Lyra, her small figure bent in a hopeful, determined act of cultivation. They were not packing. They were not leaving. They were putting down roots. Their actions were their answer, spoken more clearly than any words could. They were staying. They were home. The seasons turned. The last of the snows melted, feeding the creeks and turning the mountain meadows green. The quiet, methodical rhythm of life in the cabin solidified into a new kind of normal. The three of them moved around each other with an easy, practiced grace, a silent choreography of shared existence. Silas taught them the deeper secrets of the mountains. How to read the clouds to predict the weather. How to find the best fishing spots in the fast-running creek. How to track a deer for miles without being seen. In return, they brought a life to the cabin that it had never known. Lyra's small garden flourished, providing fresh herbs and vegetables that transformed their simple meals. She had a gentle hand, and soon, wildflowers began to appear in tin cans on the windowsill. Alara took charge of the cabin's interior, her quiet efficiency bringing a sense of order and warmth to the stark space. She mended their clothes, baked bread in a small Dutch oven, and established a routine that made the cabin feel less like a bastion and more like a hearth. The single room was still a single room, but it was no longer a space of solitude. It was a space of union. One evening, as the sun set, casting long golden fingers of light across the valley, they sat together on the porch. It had become their ritual. They rarely spoke during these times, content to watch the changing colors of the sky and listen to the sounds of the wilderness settling in for the night. Silas was carving, his knife moving slowly over a piece of birch wood. He was working on a figure of a bear, its form powerful and protective. Galera was mending a shirt, her needle flashing in the fading light. Lyra was humming her soft, sad tune, but it sounded different now, less sad, more thoughtful. Silas paused his carving and looked over at the two women. He looked at Alara, her brow furrowed in concentration, the setting sun catching the auburn glints in her dark hair. He saw the strength that had never wavered, the fierce protective love she had for her sister, a love he understood completely. He looked at Lyra, who had leaned her head against her sister's shoulder, her eyes half closed in contentment. He saw the resilience that had brought her back from the brink of death, the quiet courage that had allowed her to flourish in this harsh place. He thought of his life before the storm, the long, empty years of silence, the cold peace of his solitude. He had thought it was enough. He had been wrong. He had not realized how hollow it was until it had been filled. These two women, who had stumbled into his life out of a blizzard, had breached the walls of his fortress not with force, but with their quiet, stubborn refusal to be broken. They had shown him that survival was not just about enduring, but about connecting. He looked down at the half-finished bear in his hands. He smoothed the rough edge with his thumb. A subtle change had come over his face. The hard lines etched by wind and loss had not vanished, but they seemed softer, less severe. For the first time in a decade, the lines at the corners of his eyes held not just the memory of hardship, but the faintest glimmer of a different emotion. It was not a smile. It was something deeper, quieter. It was peace. He looked out at the vast, wild land that was their home. The smoke from their chimney rose in a thin, straight line into the twilight sky. A beacon, a signal. It did not signal a man in isolation. It signaled a family. A new, unconventional family, forged in a storm and tempered by fire, now safe and whole in the heart of the wilderness.